Make sure my hair is good. We good? Alright. We good. What's going down, YouTube? It's your boy Dstyles, and welcome to episode 2 of Shooting with Style. On today's episode, we are going to begin our journey into the exposure triangle. Now, in my last video, I mentioned the exposure triangle when we were breaking down the different modes that your camera has. If you did not see that video, the link is going to be right around in this area, so definitely go check that out. Or also, if you know a little bit of what I'm talking about in terms of like the different modes of your cameras, like shutter speed priority, aperture priority, and the other modes, then you should be good for what we're about to talk about. Let's break down, first of all, what is the exposure triangle. So I like to think of it, because I'm a gamer. So when you think about triangles in video gaming, you think about, the triangle button on the PlayStation controller. You think about just the triangle in Asteroids, because you control like a little triangle ship. But I would like to make the call to the exposure triangle as the Triforce from Legend of Zelda. Now, the Triforce is 3 equal parts. Each part has a meaning. Well, that's the same thing with the exposure triangle. So it could be said that the exposure triangle is the Triforce of photography. Much like you have with the Triforce in the Legend of Zelda series, you have the Triforce of Power, Triforce of Wisdom, and Triforce of Courage, and they all form together to make this one artifact called the Triforce. It's the same way with the exposure triangle. All the parts equal the whole. So each part has a very important role to play in getting the whole, because you have shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Oh man, why couldn't they just call it the exposure Triforce then? So yeah, hopefully for my gamers out there, you guys were able to get that reference as to how each piece works together. For my non-gamers, let me break it down a little bit for you. Exposure as a whole is not one thing, like you could just flip one switch and then you'll be fine. It requires equal help from all sides. So, you have to change your ISO, but if you change your ISO, then you have to, change your shutter speed to affect for the fact that the scene is slightly brighter. And if you change your aperture, you gotta bring both of those values down, and it's a lot. So for what you need to know for now is that each piece works together with the other two, and they pretty much work in perfect harmony to get you your perfect exposure. So now let's break down these individual pieces. This episode will be dedicated to breaking down aperture. So let's go into what aperture is. Aperture is defined as a hole or an opening. If we were to take a quick glance at our cameras, we know the holes or openings that, make up the camera, help produce us the image. And that is, wait for it. Wait, let me see if I can do it. Oh, okay, yeah, it worked. So, we have a hole or opening right here, and it's the lens. Let me just take off this cap right here. And not sure if the camera can make it out, but you can actually look through when you take off the back cap of the camera lens and the lens cap. You see a little hole. But you also see these little blades, like these little pieces inside of your lens, and they are called aperture blades. So essentially, we know that aperture is a hole, and we can control how big or how small that hole is with our camera. So for newer mirrorless lenses, you typically have one ring on the lens that can control focus and aperture if you wish, but mainly for a fixed focal length lens like this 85 right here. This is a focus ring, but some of you might have manual lenses and you'll have a ring dedicated to adjusting aperture. So you can definitely, like, you know, play around with it, look through the lens, see how that hole opens and closes, so you can get a better understanding of the aperture hole. But now that begs the question, what does a hole do for us? The reason why the hole is important to us is because there's a value associated with aperture. So when the hole is wide open, that's typically equated with a low numerical value. So the lowest on most consumer camera lenses is f1.4. That is the lowest numerical value. The highest that you'll run into is either f16 on older lenses or f22. That's a high numerical value. Now, the thing is, when you have an f number of 1.4, for example, technically that is a high value because you're letting the most light in, as seen by this image that I'm about to put up on screen of a shot that I did with the aperture wide open at, I believe this was f1.8. So took the shot, aperture was wide open. As you can see, it's very bright. The colors are nice. It's letting in a whole lot of light. It doesn't look dark at all. Whereas, you know, you come over to this image I shot with the aperture at, I believe, f13 or 14, somewhere up there. But just shooting with that dark of aperture, keeping the same settings, you can see that the frame is very dark. You can't really make out any detail. Now, that can be remedied by changing the other two values in the exposure triangle. You could probably lower the shutter speed to let more light in, to keep the sensor open. You could raise the ISO to make the sensor more susceptible to pick up any light in the scene. That's just two of the ways that this triangle works together. If you change one value, you have to change one or both of the other values based on the look you're going for. The takeaway for aperture is that the lower your numerical value, the more light you're letting in. The higher numerical value, the less light you're letting in. Now, depending on what you want to shoot, you can mess around with these values, depending on the scene. If you want to go for like a very shadowy, dark, gritty scene, sure, you can shoot it like a very low aperture number, like maybe 8, 10. Or, you know, if you're shooting in a studio, right, and you have a lot of LED lights, you might need to crank that aperture up to f8 or something to make sure that you're not overexposed, right? You don't have a whole lot of highlights. The scene isn't whited out. But aperture helps with one other concept, and it's called depth of field. So what depth of field is, it is simply the presence of an element that's in focus versus an element that's out of focus, right? So it is literally like the depth of the focusing area. So as you can see, my face is in focus right now. The bookcase, not so much. You can't really read the titles that are up on my books. You can't see the label. You can't like really make out what's written on my pens. I got some really cool pens, by the way. But that's depth of field. And you can also see it in this picture right here. You know, my subject in the foreground is perfectly in focus, but as you move further back into this scene, you start to see elements become blurry and out of focus. And that's mainly done for aesthetic effect. And speaking of aesthetic effect, we can't talk about Aperture without talking about bokeh. Quick sidebar, it is not pronounced bokeh. It's bokeh. Okay? What bokeh pretty much is, it's just like the aesthetic presence of those little light balls that I was telling you about. So let's take a look at this image here. You see I have my subject is on the left side of the frame in the foreground, and you see like all the traffic lights in the background have just like blended together. They look like these little light balls, and they're shining like tiny little pearls of light, and it looks just so beautiful. And the background has like a nice creamy texture. That's like the best way to put it, because everything just blends together. That's bokeh. And that's what you will find a lot of on Instagram. And, you know, if that's your thing, go for it. It makes for really nice images. Personally, you know, I'll do it if it suits the mood. I just won't do it all the time because I think it gets boring after a while. As photographers, you know, we have to innovate. Now, if you do some really cool stuff with your lights in the background, then that's doing something. You know, putting your lights in a certain pattern, you know, texturizing the background so it all blends together. But, you know, bokeh pretty much, it's just solely for aesthetics, right? And you could say that Aperture is the piece of the triangle that you want to focus on if you're going for foreground versus background aesthetics. And that about wraps it up for this video on Aperture. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them down in the comment section below, and you know, I will get to them as I can. I might even make like a little office hours segment for any questions. And you know, if you feel so inclined, you want to keep up with the lessons, you want to find out when the next video is dropping, here's a hint, it's next week. Then go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and also hit that little bell notification so you are notified as soon as that next video goes live. So once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Next video will be part 2 of the exposure triangle series, and we're gonna go over shutter speed. Hopefully I will see y'all there. All right, have a good one, y'all, and remember, keep shooting. Peace.